The castle erupted in flames against the winter sky, its wooden towers collapsing like a house of cards as warriors materialized from the mountainside in broad daylight. Tokugawa Kazumasu, one of Oda Nobunaga's most trusted generals, watched in stunned disbelief as his supposedly impregnable fortress crumbled before an enemy that shouldn't have existed. These weren't samurai charging with banners flying. They were ghosts made flesh, striking without warning and vanishing like smoke. In a single afternoon, the men of Iga had just announced to all of Japan that there was still one place the great unifier could not conquer, one republic that refused to kneel. What Tokugawa couldn't have known as he fled through the burning gates of Maruyama was that he had just witnessed the opening act of the most audacious David and Goliath story in Japanese history. Hidden in the mountain fastness of Iga Province lived the last free people in a nation rapidly falling under the iron fist of warlords, a confederation of warrior farmers who had done the impossible by creating Japan's only functioning democracy. They called themselves many things, but history would remember them by another name: ninja. And in 3 short years, their defiance would force the most powerful man in Japan to unleash an army of 42,000 soldiers to crush fewer than 10,000 mountain rebels who refused to surrender their freedom. This is the story of how a handful of shadows changed the course of an empire. Long before they became the stuff of legend, the ancestors of the Iga ninja were something far more dangerous to the establishment than assassins lurking in shadows. They were tax resistors. In the rolling mountains of central Japan, where mist clung to ancient cedar forests and steep valleys offered perfect hiding places, a peculiar breed of rebel had taken root. They called themselves the Akutu, literally evil bands. Though their only crime was refusing to pay tribute to distant masters who had never set foot on their soil. The Akutu weren't born from some grand political philosophy or noble cause. They emerged from pure, practical stubbornness. For generations, the great Todaiji temple in Nara had claimed dominion over Iga Province, demanding taxes from farmers who scratched out livings on mountainsides too steep for proper rice cultivation. But unlike the docile peasants elsewhere in Japan, the mountain folk of Iga had a dangerous habit. They fought back. When tax collectors arrived with their scrolls and demands, they found themselves facing not bowing farmers but armed bands who melted into the forest like morning mist. What began as scattered acts of defiance grew into something unprecedented. Organized, sustained resistance that lasted over a century. The battles between Todaiji and the Akutu became legendary for their cunning and brutality. The temple's forces would march into Iga with overwhelming numbers, only to find their quarry had vanished into a landscape that seemed to swallow armies whole. Supply lines stretched thin across mountain passes where a handful of defenders could hold off hundreds. Messengers disappeared on forest paths that twisted like serpents through valleys where echoes could deceive even the most experienced tracker. The Akutu perfected the art of making large forces feel very small and very lost. By the time the smoke cleared, Todaiji had been bled white by a century of guerrilla warfare. The great temple's authority crumbled not through dramatic battles, but through the slow, patient work of men who understood that power built on fear could be toppled by those who refused to be afraid. Where once a single overlord had ruled, now 500 different lords carved up the province like a patchwork quilt, each controlling their own valley, their own clan, their own destiny. It was chaos by any conventional measure, yet somehow it worked. The descendants of the Akutu had accidentally invented something that wouldn't have a name for centuries: democracy through decentralization. They had also, without knowing it, laid the foundation for the greatest ninja confederation in Japanese history. 500 lords ruling a single province should have been a recipe for eternal civil war. in the narrow valleys of Iga, where a man could throw a stone from one lord's territory into another's, the potential for bloodshed was staggering. Every petty grievance could spark a conflict. Every boundary dispute could escalate into a feud that lasted generations. The mathematics of human nature suggested that 500 proud, armed men trying to share power would inevitably destroy each other. Instead, they did something that would have been considered impossible anywhere else in feudal Japan. They learned to vote. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For decades after Todaiji's collapse, Iga teetered on the edge of chaos as warlords tested each other's resolve and measured each other's armies. But gradually, a stark reality imposed itself on even the most hot-headed clan leader. If they spent all their time fighting each other, they would have nothing left to defend against the next would-be conqueror from the outside world. The mountains that had protected them from Todaiji's tax collectors wouldn't save them from a determined enemy if they were too busy stabbing each other in the back to mount a unified defense. What emerged from this crucible of necessity was breathtaking in its audacity. The Iga Sokoku Iki, the League of all the Commons of Iga. 12 representatives, chosen by popular vote from among the 500 lords, would gather in council to decide matters affecting the entire province. When disputes arose between clans, they brought their cases not to the battlefield, but to this assembly, where debate replaced bloodshed and consensus overruled conquest. It was democracy dressed in samurai armor, a parliament of warriors who had discovered that talking was more profitable than fighting. The system's genius lay in its built-in protection against tyranny. No single leader could dominate, because power was deliberately fragmented among the 12, and those 12 could only serve at the pleasure of the 500 lords who had elected them. If a representative grew too ambitious or forgot who had put him in power, he found himself voted out at the next assembly. The constant threat of political death kept everyone honest, or at least more honest than warlords typically managed to be. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of the Iga Republic wasn't its democratic structure. It was how quickly this collection of former tax rebels transformed themselves into something far more dangerous. The same men who had perfected guerrilla warfare against Todaiji's collectors now turned those skills toward more lucrative pursuits. They became spies, infiltrators, and mercenaries for hire, selling their services to anyone with enough gold and sense to appreciate warriors who could disappear into mist and reappear behind enemy lines. The world beyond Iga's mountains was discovering that the mountain folk had evolved beyond simple rebellion. They had become professionals in the arts of stealth and deception. The ninja had arrived on the stage of history, and Japan would never be the same. High in the cloud-shrouded peaks, where eagles nested and ancient cedars pierced the sky like prayers made manifest, the men of Iga discovered that becoming invisible required more than learning to hide. It demanded a complete reconstruction of the human soul. The transformation from mountain rebels to shadow warriors didn't happen in dojos or training grounds, but in sacred places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual world grew thin as morning mist. The mountains themselves were the first teachers, in valleys so steep that sunlight touched the ground for only a few hours each day, where waterfalls thundered through gorges carved by millennia of patient erosion. The Iga warriors learned lessons no swordmaster could teach. They discovered that true stealth meant becoming one with the landscape, not just hiding behind a tree, but thinking like the tree, breathing like the tree, until even trained eyes would pass over them without recognition. Winter nights spent motionless in snowdrifts taught them that the body could endure what the mind believed impossible. Summer days tracking prey through forests where a single snapped twig could mean death refined their senses until they could hear a heartbeat at 50 paces. But it was the arrival of the Yamabushi, the mountain ascetics, that transformed physical training into something approaching mysticism. These warrior monks, followers of the legendary Eno Ozunu, who was said to command demons and travel instantly across vast distances, brought with them practices that pushed human capabilities beyond conventional limits. They taught the Iga men that invisible movement required invisible thoughts, that the mind projecting fear or aggression would betray the most perfectly concealed body. Through meditation techniques borrowed from esoteric Buddhism and breathing exercises that could slow the heart to near-death rhythms, the ninja learned to become psychologically invisible as well as physically. The spiritual dimension wasn't mere superstition, it was practical psychology centuries ahead of its time, when an infiltrator could calm his mind to such depths that his own fear scent disappeared, when a scout could project such perfect mental stillness that guards would unconsciously avoid looking in his direction, when a warrior could move with such complete confidence that observers would assume he belonged wherever he appeared. These were advantages worth more than any weapon. The Yamabushi taught that Eno Ozunu's legendary powers weren't supernatural gifts, but natural abilities unlocked through proper training of both body and spirit. Over the centuries, this fusion of democratic governance, guerrilla tactics, and mystical training created something unprecedented in Japanese history. The Iga ninja weren't just skilled fighters. They were warrior philosophers who understood that true power came not from force, but from the ability to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. They had learned to wage war not just with swords and arrows, but with psychology, misdirection, and an almost supernatural understanding of human nature. In their mountain sanctuary, protected by peaks that seemed to scrape the very heavens, they had become something that would terrify warlords across Japan. Shadows with souls, ghosts with democratic ideals, and rebels who had discovered that the greatest weapon of all was the enemy's own assumptions about what was possible. The message that arrived in Iga during the autumn of 1487 should have been cause for terror. Shogun Ashikaga Yoshihisa, wielder of imperial authority and commander of vast armies, was marching south to crush the upstart Rokkaku clan in Omi Province. Any sensible warlord would have kept his head down and his gates closed when the supreme military leader of Japan went to war. But the 12-member Council of Iga read the dispatch with something closer to anticipation than fear, because hidden within the formal declaration of war was an opportunity that might never come again. Rokkaku Takayori, the embattled daimyo facing the shogun's wrath, had sent secret envoys through the mountain passes with an offer that could change everything. He would pay handsomely for allies willing to strike at the shogun's forces, but he needed warriors who could do what conventional armies could not: appear where they were least expected, vanish when pursuit seemed certain, and turn the very landscape into a weapon against invaders. The Rokkaku envoys spoke carefully, never using the word ninja directly, but their meaning was crystal clear. They had heard rumors of the shadow warriors of Iga and Koga, and they were willing to bet their lives on those rumors being true. The decision to accept required a vote that would echo through history. In smoky mountain halls lit by flickering torches, the assembled lords of Iga debated with passionate intensity. Some argued for caution. Why risk their hard-won independence for a stranger's war? Others saw deeper implications. If the shogun could crush Rokkaku with impunity, how long before those same armies turned toward the mountains? But it was an unexpected voice that tipped the balance. A messenger from Koga, their rival confederation in the neighboring province, carrying an offer of alliance that stunned even the most experienced negotiators. For generations, Iga and Koga had eyed each other across their shared borders with the wariness of wolf packs occupying adjacent territories. They practiced similar arts, governed themselves through similar councils, and competed for the same mercenary contracts that funded their independence. But Koga's message was blunt in its pragmatism. The shogun represented a threat that neither confederation could face alone, but together they might accomplish something that would reshape the balance of power in central Japan. The Shadow Warriors were about to step into the sunlight of recorded history. When Yoshihisa's massive army encountered the combined forces of Rokkaku, Iga, and Koga, they expected a conventional battle against conventional enemies. Instead, they found themselves fighting ghosts who struck from impossible angles and vanished before counterattacks could be organized. Supply trains disappeared in broad daylight. Messengers were found tied to trees with their dispatches missing, and sentries reported seeing enemy forces in 3 different locations simultaneously. The shogun's disciplined ranks, trained for formal warfare between honor-bound samurai, discovered that honor was a luxury their enemies had discarded in favor of something far more dangerous: effectiveness. The campaign that should have been a triumphant display of shogunal power became a humiliating retreat that sent shockwaves through the corridors of Kyoto. For the first time in living memory, the supreme authority in Japan had been forced to withdraw by an alliance of mountain rebels who refused to fight by the established rules. More importantly for the future of the ninja confederations, Iga and Koga had discovered that their combined strength was greater than the sum of their parts. The alliance forged in the crucible of that campaign would endure for nearly a century, creating the most formidable intelligence and guerrilla warfare network in Japanese history. The shadows had learned to cast longer shadows, and the sun of conventional warfare would never seem quite as bright again. 73 years after their first taste of victory against the shogun, the ninja confederations had evolved into something that made warlords across Japan wake up in cold sweats. By 1560, their reputation had grown to mythical proportions. Stories circulated in sake houses and castle halls of warriors who could walk through walls, become invisible at will, and kill with a single touch. Most of these tales were nonsense, but the kernel of truth hidden within the folklore was far more terrifying than any supernatural power. The ninja had become consummate professionals in the arts of infiltration and assassination, and they were available to the highest bidder. When Tokugawa Ieyasu, still a minor lord, scratching for survival in the brutal politics of the Sengoku period, found himself facing an impossible military problem, he did what desperate commanders had been doing for decades. He sent a message to the mountains of Koga. The Imagawa clan held Kasagi Castle, a fortress positioned like a dagger pointed at Tokugawa's heart, and its garrison of over 200 warriors made conventional assault tantamount to suicide. But Ieyasu had heard whispers of what the Shadow Warriors could accomplish when unleashed against enemies who still believed in the old rules of siege warfare. The contract negotiations took place in a moonless forest clearing, far from prying eyes and listening ears. Tomosuke Sada, the Koga leader chosen to command the mission, studied the crude maps and intelligence reports with the calculating gaze of a master craftsman examining a particularly complex commission. 80 men, he decided, enough to overwhelm the garrison once they were inside, but few enough to move through enemy territory without detection. The price was steep enough to fund Koga operations for months, but more importantly, success would cement their reputation with a rising power who might remember their services when fortune smiled upon him. What followed was a masterpiece of military infiltration that would be studied and whispered about for generations. The 80 Koga warriors didn't approach Kasagi Castle like an army. They drifted toward it like smoke, arriving individually or in pairs over the course of several nights. Some came disguised as merchants, others as wandering monks or traveling craftsmen. A few simply materialized within the castle grounds through methods that the surviving defenders would never be able to explain adequately. By the night of the attack, the fortress was honeycombed with enemies who had become part of its daily rhythm. The assault began not with war cries or the clash of steel, but with the whisper of flames catching hold in carefully prepared locations throughout the castle. The wooden towers that dominated the fortress's skyline became torches that lit the night sky, creating chaos and confusion that masked the systematic elimination of key targets. The Castellan died in his private chambers, never knowing that death had been sharing his evening meal. 200 garrison troops found themselves fighting shadows in smoke-filled corridors where every familiar landmark had become a death trap. By dawn, Kasagi Castle was a smoldering ruin in Tokugawa hands, and the Koga warriors had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The perfection of the operation sent ripples of terror and admiration through the warrior class of central Japan. Here was proof that the old certainties, thick walls, loyal retainers, and overwhelming numbers meant nothing against enemies who could rewrite the rules of engagement at will. More ominously for the future, it demonstrated that the ninja confederations had transcended their origins as mountain rebels to become something far more dangerous. A shadow military that could tip the balance of power between conventional armies. The age of the ninja had truly begun, and every lord in Japan now had to calculate not just the strength of his enemies' armies, but whether those enemies had the gold and the desperation to hire the services of the mountain warriors who fought wars in the spaces between heartbeats. In the spring of 1567, as cherry blossoms drifted like snow across the battlefields of central Japan, a name began appearing in intelligence reports that reached the mountain councils of Iga with increasing frequency: Oda Nobunaga. To most observers, he was simply another ambitious warlord in a land already saturated with ambitious warlords, distinguished mainly by his youth and his disturbing habit of burning temples filled with warrior monks. But the ninja had survived for centuries by reading the deeper currents of political change, and what they saw in Nobunaga's methodical campaigns filled their council chambers with urgent, whispered debates. Unlike the traditional daimyo who fought for glory, honor, or the preservation of ancient privileges, Nobunaga waged war with the cold efficiency of a man redesigning the very foundations of Japanese society. When he invaded Iga Province that year, targeting the venerable Kitabatake clan who had ruled there for generations, he didn't simply defeat them, he systematically dismantled their power structure like a master carpenter, taking apart a house he intended to rebuild from scratch. Clan loyalties that had endured for centuries were severed with bribes, threats, and political marriages. Ancient bloodlines were redirected through adoption and assassination until they served his purposes rather than their own traditions. The speed of his conquest was breathtaking, but it was his methods that sent chills through the Iga leadership. Nobunaga didn't just want to rule Japan. He wanted to remake it as a unified state where every village, every castle, and every mountain pass served a single central authority. In his vision of the future, there would be no room for independent confederations, democratic councils, or autonomous regions that owed allegiance to no one but themselves. The ninja confederations weren't just obstacles to his ambitions. They were living contradictions to everything he believed about how power should be organized and controlled. The first direct threat materialized when Nobunaga placed his son, Nobukatsu, in control of the conquered Ise territories. The young lord inherited not just his father's ambitions, but also his father's methodical approach to eliminating potential problems before they became actual problems. In December 1576, father and son orchestrated the Mise incident, a dinner party that became a mass execution as they systematically murdered the remaining Kitabatake leadership. The message was unmistakable. Nobunaga's idea of diplomacy involved ensuring that potential enemies could never betray him because they were already dead. With Ise firmly under Oda control, the mountains of Iga found themselves surrounded by territories that served the man who had declared himself the rightful ruler of all Japan. Every mountain pass that had once led to neutral ground now opened onto lands where Nobunaga's spies watched and his soldiers patrolled. The ancient trade routes that had funded the Ninja Confederation's independence were being strangled by checkpoints and travel permits. More ominously, refugees fleeing Nobunaga's other conquests brought tales of entire provinces being reorganized according to his vision of centralized efficiency, a vision that had no place for warrior democrats who insisted on governing themselves. The 12-member council of Iga faced a choice that would have seemed unthinkable just a generation earlier. For over a century, they had thrived by remaining above the petty squabbles of conventional warlords, selling their services to the highest bidder while maintaining strict neutrality in larger conflicts. But Nobunaga wasn't a conventional warlord. He was a force of historical change that would either remake Japan in his image or be stopped by those with the courage and capability to resist him. The age of profitable neutrality was ending, and the ninjas would soon discover whether their mountain sanctuary could protect them from a man who had made a career of proving that nothing was truly impregnable. The storm was gathering, and even shadows could not hide from lightning that illuminated everything under heaven. The construction crews arrived at the Maruyama Plateau in the autumn of 1578, with the quiet confidence of men building something permanent. Under the direction of Tokugawa Kazumasu, one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, they began raising walls and towers that would serve as the staging point for the inevitable conquest of Iga Province. The location was chosen with mathematical precision, close enough to the Iga border to project unmistakable menace, defensible enough to withstand any conventional assault, and positioned to control the mountain passes that had protected the ninja confederations for generations. To Nobukatsu and his father, it represented the logical next step in their systematic absorption of central Japan. To the watchers hidden in the mountain forests, it looked like a dagger pointed at the heart of their world. The intelligence reports that filtered back to the Iga Council painted a picture of methodical preparation for invasion. Maruyama wasn't being built as a simple frontier fortress. It was designed as a military base capable of housing thousands of troops and serving as a supply depot for extended campaigns in difficult terrain. The engineers were installing features specifically intended for mountain warfare. Expanded stables for pack animals, reinforced granaries for extended sieges, and elevated watchtowers that could monitor movement across the valleys that had hidden Iga raiders for centuries. Most ominously, the construction crews included specialists in siege warfare who were clearly preparing for assaults on the small but strategically placed fortifications that protected Iga's key passes. The debate in the council chambers grew heated as autumn deepened toward winter. The pragmatists argued for patience, let Nobukatsu complete his castle, and then demonstrate the futility of his position through harassment and economic pressure. The hotheads demanded immediate action. Strike now while the fortifications were incomplete, and the garrison was still small. But it was the strategic thinkers who carried the day with an argument that would have terrified Nobunaga had he been able to hear it. Maruyama represented more than a military threat. It was a test of will that would determine whether the ninja confederations would be remembered as the last free warriors of Japan or the last cowards. The decision to attack was unanimous, but the methods sparked fierce debate that revealed the evolution of ninja tactical thinking. Traditional infiltration was impossible. The construction site was too well guarded and too exposed for stealth approaches. Conventional siege tactics were suicidal. The Iga forces lacked the numbers and equipment for formal warfare. What they proposed instead was so audacious it bordered on madness. A broad daylight assault that would use speed, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the terrain to overwhelm defenders who expected to face either shadows or massed armies, but never warriors who combined both approaches. November 24th dawned crisp and clear, with visibility so perfect that sentries on Maruyama's half-completed walls could see for miles across the surrounding valleys. It was exactly the kind of day when no sensible commander would expect an attack, which made it perfect for warriors who had built their reputation on doing things no sensible commander would attempt. The assault began not with war cries, but with the strange sight of armed men materializing from landscapes that moments before had appeared completely empty. They came from impossible directions, down sheer cliff faces, up from stream beds, across open ground where no cover existed, moving with such coordination that they seemed to flow like water finding its level. Tokugawa's first indication that something was wrong came when his sentries began shouting contradictory reports about enemy positions. The raiders appeared to be attacking from all directions simultaneously, but the numbers made no sense. There seemed to be far more attackers than the terrain could possibly conceal. By the time he realized he was facing warriors who could use the landscape itself as camouflage, fire was already racing through the wooden structures of his unfinished fortress. The Iga forces hadn't come to capture Maruyama. They had come to erase it so completely that even its foundations would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider building cages for mountain eagles. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, but its consequences would echo for 3 years. As Tokugawa retreated through the burning ruins of his strategic masterpiece, he carried with him the knowledge that the ninja confederations had just crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. They had publicly humiliated the son of Japan's most powerful warlord, destroyed a major military installation in broad daylight, and demonstrated that their mountains remained unconquerable as long as they possessed the will to defend them. It was a magnificent victory that guaranteed their destruction, a perfect tactical success that would prove to be the greatest strategic blunder in the history of the Shadow Warriors. The ninja had just announced to Nobunaga that they preferred death to submission, and he was precisely the kind of man to take them at their word. The humiliation festered in Nobukatsu's mind like an infected wound, growing more painful with each passing month, as courtiers whispered behind silk fans about the young lord who had let mountain rebels burn his castle in broad daylight. By the autumn of 1579, his advisors had grown weary of his obsession with avenging the Maruyama disaster, but Nobukatsu had inherited his father's relentless nature, along with his father's ambitions. The difference was that while Nobunaga channeled his fury into systematic calculation, his son burned with the impatience of youth and the sting of wounded pride. That combination would prove nearly fatal. Against the council of his most experienced generals, Nobukatsu began assembling an invasion force that reflected his determination to settle accounts with the Iga confederations once and for all. 8,000 men, a massive army by the standards of mountain warfare, gathered at Matsugashima in early October, their campfires stretching like fallen stars across the coastal plain. The force included veteran samurai, skilled archers, and specialists in siege warfare, all equipped for an extended campaign in difficult terrain. To observers, it represented overwhelming superiority that should have crushed any resistance the mountain rebels could offer. To the ninja scouts watching from hidden positions in the surrounding hills, it looked like exactly the kind of cumbersome, conventional force they had been training to destroy for generations. The intelligence network that had once served the ninja as a source of profitable information now functioned as an early warning system for survival. Merchants loyal to the mountain clans reported troop movements, temple priests passed along overheard conversations, and farmers noted the direction of supply convoys with the careful attention of men whose lives depended on knowing when storms were approaching. By the time Nobukatsu's army began its march toward the mountain passes on October 6th, the Iga defenders knew not just the size and composition of the invasion force, but its planned route, its intended objectives, and most importantly, the young commander's psychological weaknesses. The pass at Nagano had been chosen by Nobukatsu's advisors precisely because it offered the safest approach to Iga territory, wide enough for large formations, defensible against ambush, and leading directly to the heartland of the confederations. What the planners failed to appreciate was that the ninja had spent decades studying every stone and tree along that route, mapping sightlines and escape routes until they knew the terrain better than the deer that browsed there. More critically, they had prepared the pass not for defense, but for destruction, creating what would later be recognized as one of the most sophisticated military ambushes in Japanese history. The attack began in the pre-dawn darkness of October 7th, as Nobukatsu's advance guard entered the narrowest section of the pass, where steep walls channeled the marching columns into a killing ground, barely wide enough for 50 men abreast. The first indication of trouble came not from sentries or scouts, but from the sudden realization that the familiar morning sounds of the forest had fallen completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant animal movement. In that unnatural quiet, 8,000 men found themselves walking into a trap that had been 3 centuries in the making. The assault materialized from the landscape itself as warriors who had seemed to be boulders, fallen logs, and patches of shadow suddenly erupted into motion. Arrows fell from impossible angles as archers positioned on ledges and in treetops unleashed volleys that turned the narrow pass into a gallery of death. The confined space that should have protected the advancing army instead became its doom as men struggled to deploy weapons and maintain formations while being attacked from above, below, and both sides simultaneously. Nobukatsu's overwhelming numerical advantage became meaningless when only the front ranks could engage enemies who struck from positions that conventional tactics had never been designed to address. The young lord's response revealed both his courage and his fatal inexperience as he led repeated attempts to storm positions that melted away like mist before regrouping in new locations. Each charge up the steep slopes cost dozens of lives, while accomplishing nothing more than the capture of empty ground that the defenders had already abandoned. By midday, the invasion force that had entered the pass with such confidence was retreating in disorder, leaving behind equipment, wounded, and the shattered remnants of Nobukatsu's reputation as a competent military commander. The ninjas had achieved another impossible victory, but this time their triumph carried the seeds of absolute catastrophe. They had not just defeated Nobunaga's son, they had made him look foolish in front of his own troops, and that was an insult that would demand payment in blood measured by the thousands. When the message reached Nobunaga at Azuchi Castle, detailing his son's second humiliation at the hands of mountain rebels, witnesses reported that the great warlord's initial response was not rage but something far more terrifying. A cold, calculating silence that stretched for nearly an hour. He dismissed his retainers, locked himself in his private chambers, and began planning what would become the most methodical extermination campaign in Japanese military history. The man who had earned the nickname Demon King of the Sixth Heaven for his ruthless destruction of Buddhist temples was about to demonstrate why even demons feared him when his family honor was at stake. The army that began assembling across 6 provinces in the late summer of 1581 was less a military force than an instrument of geological change. 42,000 soldiers, larger than most of the individual campaigns that had unified central Japan, converged on the borders of Iga like tectonic plates, preparing to crush everything between them. But this wasn't simply overwhelming force deployed in anger. It was overwhelming force deployed with the systematic precision that had made Nobunaga the most feared general of his generation. Every approach to Iga Province would be sealed simultaneously, every escape route blocked, every stronghold invested with forces large enough to conduct independent campaigns. The intelligence reports that reached the Iga Council through increasingly desperate channels painted a picture of their approaching doom with mathematical clarity. Niwa Nagahide and Takigawa Kazumasu would lead 12,000 men through Tsuge to the northeast, an army larger than most daimyo could field for their entire campaigns. Nobukatsu, burning for redemption, commanded 10,000 troops advancing through the Aoyama Pass, with explicit orders to show no mercy to anyone who had participated in his previous humiliations. From every cardinal direction, veteran commanders with proven track records in mountain warfare were bringing forces equipped specifically for the siege and destruction of fortified positions in difficult terrain. Against this avalanche of military might, the Iga confederations could muster perhaps 10,000 defenders scattered across dozens of small fortifications throughout the province. The mathematics were stark enough to silence even the most optimistic voices in the council chambers. They were outnumbered more than 4-1 by enemies who would attack simultaneously from positions that eliminated any possibility of mutual support between isolated garrisons. Worse, their traditional advantages in mobility and terrain knowledge meant nothing against an invasion designed to eliminate movement entirely through sheer overwhelming presence. The campaign opened on September 30th, with a coordination that demonstrated everything Nobunaga had learned about large-scale military operations during his rise to power. Rather than advancing incrementally and allowing the defenders time to adapt, all 6 invasion columns crossed into Iga territory simultaneously at dawn, immediately severing communications between the scattered ninja strongholds. The systematic nature of the assault was breathtaking in its efficiency. This wasn't conquest, but extermination, designed to eliminate not just military resistance, but the social and political structures that had made resistance possible. The individual battles that followed were less important than their cumulative effect, as the ninja confederations discovered that their greatest strengths had become fatal weaknesses. Their democratic decision-making process couldn't function when the 12-member council was scattered across besieged fortifications with no way to communicate. Their mobility tactics were useless against enemies who didn't need to pursue. They could simply wait while tightening a ring of steel that grew smaller with each passing day. Most devastating of all, their intimate knowledge of the terrain became meaningless when that terrain was occupied by forces too numerous to ambush and too well supplied to starve out. By November, the sounds of construction echoed through valleys that had once hidden ninja camps as Nobunaga's engineers began erecting permanent fortifications designed to ensure that Iga Province could never again serve as a sanctuary for rebels. The great democratic experiment was ending not with a final climactic battle, but with the slow, methodical dismantling of everything that had made it possible. The Shadow Warriors were learning that shadows provide no protection against enemies who bring their own light, and that even the most perfect tactical abilities cannot overcome strategic impossibilities. The mathematics of annihilation had proven themselves as inexorable as gravity, and the last free republic in Japan was falling into a darkness from which there would be no return. By the time winter mists began to shroud the mountains of Iga, the Great Confederation had been reduced to 2 isolated strongholds, clinging to rocky peaks like islands in a sea of enemy banners. Everything else, the hidden villages, the mountain training camps, the council halls where democracy had once flourished, lay in smoldering ruins that stretched across valleys, now patrolled by Nobunaga's soldiers. The survivors who had retreated to these final redoubts carried with them not just their weapons and wounded, but the weight of watching an entire way of life consumed by flames that seemed to burn everything except the stone itself. The fortress of Hijiyama had become the last refuge for nearly 300 defenders, who represented the final flowering of ninja tactical genius and democratic idealism. Among them were legendary figures whose names had been whispered in fear and admiration across Japan. Momochi Sandayu, whose infiltration techniques had become the gold standard for covert operations. Fujibayashi Nagato, whose intelligence networks had once reached into the private chambers of daimyo castles, and dozens of clan leaders who had voted together in councils that would never meet again. They had retreated not in hope of victory, that had died with the first coordinated assault, but in determination to make their final stand worthy of the principles they had lived by. The siege that followed became a masterclass in the evolution of warfare, as both attackers and defenders pushed their respective arts to absolute limits. Nobunaga's forces, swollen with veterans from a dozen successful campaigns, employed every technique they had learned about reducing mountain fortifications, massive timber rams to breach gates, scaling towers tall enough to overtop the highest walls, and constant bombardment from catapults that hurled not just stones, but burning pitch designed to turn wooden structures into furnaces. Yet the defenders responded with innovations born of desperation and genius, using their intimate knowledge of the fortress's construction to create layered defenses that turned every corridor into a killing ground and every chamber into a potential tomb for unwary attackers. The psychological warfare was as intense as the physical combat, as both sides understood that they were fighting for more than military objectives. For Nobunaga's troops, this was the final act in their master's grand design to eliminate all resistance to unified rule. Success here would prove that no mountain was too high, no fortress too remote, and no tradition too ancient to escape the reach of centralized power. For the ninja defenders, every day they held out was a day that proved their ideals could not be extinguished by mere force, that the spirit of democratic resistance would outlive the physical structures that had housed it. As November deepened toward December and supply lines became increasingly precarious for both armies, the defenders faced a choice that embodied the tragic mathematics of their situation. They could continue fighting until the last man fell, ensuring that their resistance would be remembered, but guaranteeing that none would survive to carry their knowledge and traditions to future generations. Or they could surrender the fortress while negotiating for the lives of at least some who might escape to plant seeds of renewal in distant soil. The decision, reached through the same democratic process that had governed Iga for centuries, revealed the depth of their commitment to survival, not just as individuals, but as guardians of an idea. The surrender ceremony took place on a morning when frost covered the broken stones of Hijiyama like a burial shroud, transforming the fortress into a crystal monument to the end of an era. The defenders who emerged carried nothing but their personal weapons and the bitter knowledge that they were witnessing the death of Japan's last experiment in warrior democracy. Behind them, Nobunaga's soldiers poured through gates that would never again shelter free men, beginning the systematic destruction of walls that had protected not just bodies, but the revolutionary notion that power could be shared rather than concentrated in the hands of a single ruler. But even as the physical structures of Iga independence crumbled into rubble, something survived in the desperate flight of those who escaped into the mountains of Iga Province and the sanctuary offered by Tokugawa Ieyasu in distant Mikawa. They carried with them more than their lives. They preserved the memory of what had been possible, the knowledge of what had been achieved, and the hope that someday, somewhere, the ideals that had flourished in the mountains of Iga might take root again. The last fortress had fallen, but the last chapter of the ninja story was yet to be written, and it would be penned not with swords and fire, but with loyalty, service, and the patient work of men who understood that sometimes the greatest victory lies in knowing when to transform, rather than when to resist. The tea ceremony at Honnoji Temple had been proceeding with exquisite formality when the first flames appeared at the windows, transforming an elegant cultural ritual into the funeral pyre of the man who had remade Japan through sheer force of will. Oda Nobunaga's death in that burning temple sent shockwaves through every corner of the archipelago, but nowhere were those reverberations felt more acutely than in the port city of Sakai, where Tokugawa Ieyasu found himself suddenly transformed from honored guest to hunted fugitive in the space of a single messenger's breathless report. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Akechi Mitsuhide, the general who had betrayed and murdered Nobunaga, was already moving to eliminate every potential rival to his usurpation of power. Ieyasu, caught far from his home territories with only a small retinue of retainers, represented both a threat to the new regime and a tempting target for a man seeking to consolidate his position through the systematic elimination of opposition. The roads back to Mikawa Province, Normally, a journey of strategic complexity had become death traps where every checkpoint might conceal enemies, and every inn might harbor assassins loyal to the usurper. It was in this moment of desperate calculation that Hattori Hanzo stepped forward with a proposal that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't understand the peculiar relationship between the Tokugawa clan and the refugees from Iga Province, the legendary ninja whose family had served Ieyasu for decades while maintaining connections to the scattered survivors of Nobunaga's mountain campaign, possessed something more valuable than gold or armies: a network of guides, safe houses, and hidden routes through the very territory that had once been the Ninja Confederation's greatest stronghold. The escape route that Hanzo proposed was audacious in its apparent madness. Rather than attempting the direct roads where Mitsuhide's agents would certainly be waiting, they would traverse the mountains of Iga itself, using paths known only to the former inhabitants and moving through territory that conventional wisdom considered impassable for anyone not born to its secrets. The irony was almost poetic. The man who had given Nobunaga the intelligence and support necessary to destroy the Ninja Republic would now trust his life to the very shadows his patron had tried to extinguish. The journey that began before dawn on June 21st became an epic of endurance and tradecraft that demonstrated everything the ninja had learned about moving unseen through hostile territory. 300 men, former Iga and Koga warriors who had sworn new oaths of loyalty to the Tokugawa, materialized from hiding places throughout the devastated province to guide and protect their former enemy's greatest ally. They moved not as a conventional military escort, but as something far more effective: a living network of intelligence and protection that could adapt to changing circumstances with the fluid grace of water finding its way through stone. The route twisted through valleys still scarred by the fires of conquest, past the ruins of villages where democracy had once flourished, and across mountain passes where the ghosts of fallen comrades seemed to whisper encouragement to their surviving brothers. At each stage of the journey, the guides demonstrated skills that had been honed through centuries of resistance, reading the landscape for signs of danger, identifying safe crossing points that existed only in the memories of men who had grown up with the mountains as their playground, and most importantly, understanding when to move and when to remain absolutely still as patrols of Mitsuhide's soldiers passed within speaking distance of their hidden positions. The psychological dimension of the rescue was as remarkable as its physical execution, as men who had every reason to hate Tokugawa's allies instead chose to honor the debt they owed to a lord who had offered them sanctuary when their world collapsed. They were not simply guiding a political fugitive to safety. They were demonstrating that the values which had sustained the Iga confederations could survive even the destruction of the institutions that had given them form. The ninja had discovered their path to redemption, not through revenge against those who had conquered them, but through service to those who had shown them mercy in defeat. When Ieyasu's party finally reached the safety of Mikawa province, after 6 days of travel that should have been impossible, they carried with them more than the future shogun's life. They had proven that the shadow warriors could transform themselves from enemies of centralized power into its most effective guardians, that the skills developed in the service of democratic resistance could be redirected toward the protection of benevolent authority. The Great Escape had become something larger than a rescue mission. It was the first chapter of a new relationship that would eventually see former rebels become the elite guard of the Tokugawa Shogunate, protectors of the very system they had once fought to resist. The Shadows had found a new master worthy of their service, and Japan would never be quite the same. 21 years after their rescue of Tokugawa Ieyasu from certain death, the former rebels of Iga found themselves standing guard in the most secure fortress in Japan, wearing the colors of the very authority they had once sworn to resist. Edo Castle, the massive stone and timber edifice that served as the nerve center of the Tokugawa Shogunate, had become their new mountain stronghold. Except this time, instead of hiding from central authority, they were central authority's most trusted protectors. The transformation was so complete that visitors to the capital often remarked on the eerie efficiency of guards who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly, never realizing they were witnessing the final evolution of Japan's most legendary shadow warriors. The settlement of 200 Iga veterans in the Yotsuya district of Edo represented more than a reward for past service. It was a calculated integration of skills that no conventional military force could provide. Ieyasu, now the undisputed ruler of Japan, understood that maintaining power required different talents than seizing it. The same abilities that had made the ninja effective rebels, their mastery of intelligence gathering, their talent for moving unseen through hostile territory, their understanding of psychological warfare, could be redirected toward protecting a regime that depended on information, stability, and the careful management of potential threats. The irony was not lost on the surviving members of the old 12-member council, though most were careful to keep their observations private. They had fought for centuries to preserve a system where power was shared among equals, only to find themselves serving as the elite guard for the most centralized government in Japanese history. Yet there was a strange satisfaction in discovering that their democratic ideals had not died with their republic. They had simply been transformed into something that their new master found valuable. The Tokugawa administration's reliance on consensus building, intelligence networks, and the careful balancing of competing interests bore unmistakable traces of lessons learned from men who had once governed themselves through popular vote. The daily routines of castle security revealed how completely the ninja had adapted to their new role while retaining the essence of what had made them legendary. Instead of plotting raids against tax collectors, they now tracked potential assassins through the labyrinthine neighborhoods of Edo. Rather than ambushing invading armies in mountain passes, they identified and neutralized political conspiracies before they could mature into actual threats. The skills remained the same, but the objectives had been inverted. They were now the establishment they had once fought, using their intimate understanding of rebellion to prevent others from succeeding where they had failed. The arrangement worked beautifully until 1606, when the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their new existence finally erupted into open conflict. Hattori Masanari, son of the legendary Hanzo and commander of the Iga Guard, had inherited his father's name, but not his father's psychological flexibility. When economic pressures and bureaucratic changes began to erode the traditional privileges that had made service to the Tokugawa attractive, the old democratic instincts reasserted themselves with explosive force. The ninja who had once voted on matters of war and peace found themselves being treated as common soldiers expected to obey orders without question or explanation. The rebellion that followed was brief, violent, and utterly doomed. A final spasm of democratic resistance that demonstrated both the persistence of Iga's political traditions and the impossibility of resurrecting them within the Tokugawa system. The former shadow warriors who took up arms against their employers discovered that their legendary skills meant nothing when deployed against a regime that understood exactly how those skills worked and had prepared countermeasures accordingly. More devastating than any military defeat was the psychological realization that they had become obsolete, not because their abilities were no longer valuable, but because the very success of the system they served had eliminated the conditions that made their unique talents necessary. The aftermath saw the surviving ninja dispersed into new roles that reflected their reduced status and the regime's determination to prevent future insubordination. Some became musketeers in conventional military units, their stealth training subordinated to the demands of formation fighting with firearms. Others found employment as doshin, low-ranking police officials whose job was to maintain order in the growing cities rather than to conduct the sophisticated intelligence operations that had once been their specialty. The transformation was complete. The men who had once been Japan's most feared shadow warriors had become indistinguishable from any other functionaries in the vast bureaucratic machine that governed the peaceful, prosperous, and thoroughly controlled society of Tokugawa Japan. Yet even in their diminished circumstances, the ninja had achieved something that their democratic ancestors could never have imagined. They had outlived their enemies, outlasted their persecution, and found a way to serve the future rather than merely mourning the past. The Republic of Iga was gone forever, but its children had learned to thrive in a world that had no place for mountain democracies by becoming something new. Guardians of an order that valued stability over freedom, efficiency over equality, and unity over the messy compromises of shared governance. They had lost everything they had fought to preserve, yet in losing it, they had gained something perhaps more valuable. The knowledge that even the most complete defeat could be transformed into a different kind of victory by those wise enough to recognize when the world had changed and brave enough to change with it. The old man, who shuffled through the pre-dawn streets of Edo in the winter of 1868, carried himself with the careful dignity of someone whose body had outlived its usefulness, but whose mind remained sharp as the blade hidden beneath his merchant's robes. Sawamura Yasusuke had been born into a world where the word ninja still carried weight, where the descendants of Iga's shadow warriors served as an elite corps within the Tokugawa administration. Now, at 73, he found himself living through the collapse of everything that service had protected, watching 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule crumble before the advance of imperial forces who promised to restore Japan to some imagined ancient purity. The mission that had brought him into the freezing streets before dawn was both familiar and utterly unprecedented. Familiar because it required all the skills of infiltration and intelligence gathering that had been passed down through 6 generations of his family. Unprecedented because it would likely be the last time those skills were employed in service of the dying regime. The black ships of Commodore Perry had shattered Japan's isolation 14 years earlier, triggering a crisis of confidence that had grown into full-scale civil war. Now, the Tokugawa Shogunate was making its final desperate gambit, and they needed intelligence on enemy troop movements that could only be gathered by someone invisible enough to walk through hostile territory without attracting attention. The bitter irony was not lost on Sawamura, as he made his way toward the designated meeting point where other survivors of the old network would gather for what might be their final council. His great-great-grandfather had fought to preserve a mountain democracy against Nobunaga's centralization, only to see his descendants become the most loyal servants of an even more centralized system. Now that system was falling, not to another Japanese warlord, but to forces that would transform the archipelago into something none of the old ninja could have imagined. A modern nation-state that would have no more use for shadow warriors than it would for samurai or daimyo. The intelligence he had gathered over the past week painted a picture of inevitability that no amount of stealth or cunning could alter. The imperial forces were not merely militarily superior, they represented a fundamental change in how power would be organized and exercised in the new Japan. Where the Tokugawa had ruled through networks of personal loyalty and carefully balanced obligations, the Meiji Restoration promised governance through modern institutions, professional bureaucracies, and technologies that would make the ancient arts of espionage seem as quaint as battlefield archery. The age of the ninja was ending not with dramatic battles, but with the quiet obsolescence that comes when the world simply moves beyond the need for what you can provide. The final meeting took place in a tea house that had served as a safe house for over 2 centuries, its hidden passages and concealed chambers bearing witness to countless clandestine conferences where the fate of the Tokugawa regime had been debated and decided. But the men who gathered there in the gray light of winter dawn were not planning new missions or discussing strategy. They were performing the last rites for a way of life that had already died. even if its practitioners had not yet stopped breathing. The techniques that had made them legendary would survive in martial arts schools and historical chronicles, but the living tradition of ninja as active political agents was drawing its final breath. As the sun rose over a city that would soon have a new name and serve a new master, Sawamura completed his mission by delivering the intelligence that would help the Tokugawa make their last stand. It was information that everyone knew would change nothing. The old regime was doomed, regardless of what tactical advantages it might gain from superior knowledge of enemy positions. But the very act of gathering and reporting that intelligence represented something more important than its practical value. It was the final expression of a loyalty that had survived the destruction of the Iga Republic, the transformation of rebels into guardians, and the slow erosion of traditional values in a rapidly modernizing world. The Shadow Warriors had begun as tax rebels in mountain villages, evolved into the guardians of Japan's most powerful dynasty, and were ending as witnesses to the birth of a new kind of state that would have no place for their particular blend of loyalty, skill, and discretion. Yet their story was ending not in defeat but in completion. They had served their purpose, adapted to every challenge history had thrown at them, and demonstrated that even the most specialized and seemingly anachronistic traditions could find ways to remain relevant across centuries of change. The ninja were fading into legend, but they were fading as masters of their craft who had never compromised their essential nature, even as they had transformed everything else about their existence. In the end, perhaps that was the most fitting epitaph for Japan's Shadow Warriors. They had learned to become invisible, not just to their enemies, but to history itself, influencing events and protecting institutions while remaining hidden in the spaces between what was recorded and what was remembered. They had been the secret guardians of a secret nation, and their greatest achievement was that most of what they had accomplished would never be fully known or properly understood. The shadows were returning to the darkness from which they had emerged, carrying with them the knowledge that they had served well, adapted constantly, and remained true to their essential purpose, even as that purpose had been transformed beyond all recognition. The last ninja had completed the last mission, and Japan would never see their like again.